everybody. Welcome back to our channel, our Scientology Stories Peeling the Onion. And I'm here, Mark Fisher, with Janis, Gillham, Grady. How you doing, Janis?
I'm doing great. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you've been following along with us and that we have created some enthusiasm. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we appreciate all the people who have subscribed. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click on that subscribe button. And hopefully you'll like this video at the end and you'll click on the like button as well. And then also, we really appreciate the comments. Janis and I try to answer any questions that come into the comments, so that they're there. And so feel free to ask any questions that you'd like to ask. Okay.
Yeah, just so they know, there are questions that have been asked, and we will be doing future videos on a lot of those questions. So sometimes we don't actually answer them because we know we're going to come out with something on that.
Right. That's exactly right. Okay. So today's video, what we're going to be talking about is two things. Number one is, when did David Miscavige become the face of Scientology? And how does that tie in with the Road to Freedom music album that was released in 1986? And they tie in together, and we're going to be telling the story of that. I was intimately involved with the recording as the assistant producer on the album. I worked for David Miscavige at the time at the Gold Base, and we're going to tell the details and the story about that. But first, to start with it, we're going to talk about L. Ron Hubbard, because the Road to Freedom album was a series of songs that L. Ron Hubbard had written. He'd written the lyrics, and then he had written the melodies and everything. And that's how the album actually came to be, right? But he hadn't recorded them because he had been in hiding. He'd been basically on the run in hiding while Miscavige and everybody was working on trying to get an all clear from all the legal cases and the IRS investigation, so he could come back to the secret base at Gillham Hot Springs and be able to record this album. So here's a picture. We want to show you a picture of L. Ron Hubbard because he had experience doing recording and everything like that in the 70s. So here's a picture here, Janis. And why don't you describe what that is and who's in it?
Yeah, this picture was taken in Tenerife, where he was recording Power of Source. A lot of people have heard of that album before. That it was the musicians on the ship, the Apollo Stars, were doing a recording. And that's L. Ron Hubbard there with the beret on his head, and his finger is out. And next to him on his right, or to your left looking at the picture, is John Horwich, who was his son-in-law, married to his daughter Diana. And then in the center of the picture is Charlie Rush. Charlie was a drummer, came from Celebrity Center, San Jose area to Celebrity Center, and then joined the Sea Org. And he actually at that time was married to Annie. Annie is also in that picture on the right. You'll see a female in the middle there.
And you're talking about Annie, later known as Annie Broker.
Annie
right?
Tidman, Annie Broker, yes.
Right.
And then next to her on the far right is Bill Broderick, who was the audio-visual for the musicians.
Okay. And then he's actually in a recording studio wherever you all in Tenerife were recording, and he's sitting at the console with the tape deck behind him. And so he had a lot of interaction with the Gold musicians, and he fancied himself as a musician himself in terms of writing songs. The way that he would write his songs and the way that we would get them while he was gone in hiding in the 80s is he actually would dictate. He had a dictaphone everywhere he went, and he would dictate his orders or his advices, but he also would dictate like the lyrics of the songs that he wanted to do. And he also had a small keyboard where he would hunt and peck the melody that he had in his head and, the bass line or whatever it was that he had. And then those recordings would be sent down to the international base at Gillham Hot Springs, and they would be turned over to the Gold musicians, who were the Apollo musicians on the Apollo Stars, but now the Gold musicians. And they would generally take those recordings and then work out a whole arrangement for each song in terms of what instruments would play and how it would sound. And then they would submit that to L. Ron Hubbard, and he would approve it, and then the Gold musicians would go ahead and record it. Okay, so that's generally speaking how he would record music and how he would write songs. All right.
Good.
Go ahead.
No, no. Well, I was just going to say, when he dictated things, there was a office at the Gold Base in Hemet where they actually sat down and took the dictation and typed it up. And from there, it was distributed to those who it was concerned for.
That's right. That's right. Okay, and then at the Golden Era Productions, Secret Base, or whatever, we were getting the base ready for his return because we were trying to get an all clear so he could come back and do his technical films, but also his music recordings and also mixing his lectures and all that sort of thing. So what was done was we actually built a music studio. There was no music studio at the Gillham Hot Springs Resort. So it was designed and built on the property, and it was a state-of-the-art music recording studio. Okay. And it was overseen, the construction was overseen by a guy named Steve Willett. And then also he was assisted by Andre Tabayoyan, they were both long-term Sea Org members. And then Janet Ayre Swanson, who was in the Commodore's Messenger Org, she also was involved in it. And I oversaw the whole construction. David Miscavige was mainly in Los Angeles dealing with legal affairs and author services. So he wasn't up at the Gold Base that often. So I was his liaison, and I was the person who oversaw the construction of the studio and building it up from the ground up. And this studio was state of the art. They spent, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on the equipment and the construction of the studio. And it was made in such a way where if you were sitting in the control room, it would look like if you were sitting in the audience at a theater. And then through the glass window into the big recording area, it would look like you were on stage, and they had stage lights. So that was basically the theme and the motif. Do you remember the studio, Janis?
Yeah, I do remember. And I remember the costumes people having to do all the fabric that went up on the walls. And
tapestries. Yeah.
The tapestries with people's faces. So it looked like you had an audience in the tapestry.
Yeah, actually they did. And they took some of the senior messengers, including myself and my wife, Julie, and I'm sure they had other people up there as well, as models for the tapestry. So anytime I went into the music studio after it was completed, I could look up in the seating area and I'd see a tapestry version of myself and my wife. And I'm sure as soon as I blew and left or whatever, that was probably taken down.
Exactly.
Anyway, so the studio was set up for L. Ron Hubbard to come back and be able to record these albums. But of course, then in January of 1986, they had the big event, and he had passed away. L. Ron Hubbard had dropped his body in January of 1986. And there was a famous event that was held at the Hollywood Palladium on Sunset Boulevard to announce his death. And none of us knew what had happened. It was very, very secret. And so all the Gold and Int staff had to come down to the Palladium. All the Scientologists in the Los Angeles area came to fill it up. And that's when there was an announcement made, and it was made by David Miscavige. Okay. And this is actually a photograph taken from that event. He walked out in his Sea Org uniform, and he had never been seen really by the public. Nobody knew who he was except Scientology Sea Org members. The general public didn't know who he was because he was behind the scenes, just like Janis was and I was. We were not people that were out front where the majority of Scientologists all over the world would know who we were. So this is a picture of David Miscavige announcing the death of L. Ron Hubbard. And I went to the event. I know you were there too, right, Janis?
Yeah, I was there. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was quite a shock to everybody, wasn't it?
Totally. The whole place you could hear a pin drop in that room.
That's right. So anyway, what happened right after that event, March 13th was coming up. March 13th was only about a month and a half away. And we had all these songs that L. Ron Hubbard had written for what became the Road to Freedom album. And David Miscavige got the idea that as a gift to Scientologists, why don't we record and produce and package the album, both as an album and as a cassette, and have it ready to be released on March 13th, 1986, which was less than 6 weeks away. And it was a monumental task. but it was something that we had to do. Okay. And one of the reasons the songs, here's a picture of the album cover right here. It's called The Road to Freedom, L. Ron Hubbard and Friends. And the reason it's called L. Ron Hubbard and Friends is not only did he record the music, did he write the music, but also he sang on the last song called Thank You for Listening.
Right.
And when he wrote that song, Thank You for Listening, he used a dictaphone and he actually sang the lyrics of that song on the dictaphone, not intending for it to be used in any recording. But of course, he wasn't there anymore, so it couldn't be used. So Miscavige had the idea of, let's arrange a song around that recording, and that's what we did. And so L. Ron Hubbard sang in his low baritone voice, "Thank you for listening. I write just for you." And he hit some really low notes. And it's funny now thinking about it, but at the time it was very heartwarming to us Scientologists at the time who had just lost L. Ron Hubbard.
Right.
Did L. ever sing on the ship when you were around him?
What was that?
Did L. Ron Hubbard ever sing while you were around him on the ship or anything like that?
Yeah, he'd sit at his desk and he'd sing a song about wild, wild women and whiskey, or just different ballads that he remembered.
Oh my gosh. So anyway, so that was the idea. And so we were going to record the album. We only had 30 days to do it. So again, we had to work around the clock in order to do that. Now, I liaised with people at Author Services in Los Angeles to get Scientology celebrities to come and contribute and be part of the album. And of course, we got John Travolta in the 1980s, and he came up and sang on 2 of the songs. And then we had Chick Corea, who was a multi-Grammy Award winner. He recently passed away and was a longtime Scientologist and a virtuoso jazz pianist and musician. And then we got Frank Stallone. Now, this is Sylvester Stallone's brother, Frank Stallone. And in the early 80s, he was a singer. And now he'd be called a Nepo baby, But, he actually is a very talented singer and songwriter in his own right. And he had written a Golden Globe nominated song for the Staying Alive film that starred John Travolta and was directed by his brother, Sylvester Stallone, and called Far From Over. And he had a great voice, and he had sang up in Portland, Oregon during the Portland Crusade after Scientology had lost a $35 million lawsuit. He had not really done any Scientology services, but he was tight with another Scientologist named Peter Schless, and Frank Stallone agreed to come up to the Gold Base in order to record on the album.
I think Frank did the Purification rundown.
Yeah, I think so too. I think after Portland, he actually did. You're right. He probably did the Purification rundown, which brings me to the next celebrity, which was Leif Garrett. And he was a teen heartthrob in the late 70s and early 80s. And he had a singing career, doing, teeny bopper songs, and it was a big success in those days. And again, he apparently had just done the Purification rundown at Celebrity Center in Los Angeles. And so he was brought up to sing on one of the songs, and he actually did a great job. Then this is Nicky Hopkins. Now, Nicky Hopkins is a behind-the-scenes famous rock and roll piano player, keyboardist. He performed on albums for the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Joe Cocker, you name it. He performed on them. The Kinks, yeah. Yep. And he actually was referred to as the 5th or 6th Rolling Stone because he performed on so many of their albums, and he was the keyboard piano player for them. Anyway, he got involved in Scientology sometimes in the 80s, and I had no idea he was even involved, but then he agreed to come up, and he did the piano track on one of the songs on the album. Really great guy. Next one is Julia McGinnis, and in Scientology, she was known as Julia McGinnis Johnston. I think she was married at that time. She was she's still alive, a famous American soprano. She sang in operas, she was in movies, and she had a tremendous voice. And she sang on the song that Chick Corea arranged called Why Worship Death. And, so that she was brought up there. Janis, you told me something about her that I didn't know.
Yeah. Julia was in the Sea Org in 1968, and she was a regular steward on the ship.
Here, let
And
me. You sent me a picture. Let me bring it up. Okay.
yes, there she is in the white steward jacket, sitting on the rail on the poop deck, the back of the ship. Next to her on the lower left is Quentin Hubbard. And there's actually a bigger photo to this that has my mother in it as well. But we were in Marseille, France at the time, and with Hubbard coming over from the Avon River to the Royal Scotsman, Julia actually became the Commodore's steward. And and with me becoming a messenger around that same time, I got to know Julia then. And when the Commodore would wake up in the mornings, Julia, as the steward, would go into his cabin and bring him a drink and set up his clothes and that type of thing. And she also would go in there and sing to him. And she'd put on these little performances that would get him laughing and starting the day off cheerfully. So she was always fun to have around. And it was I was sad when she left, but she had petitioned the Commodore, L. Ron Hubbard, to leave the Sea Org so that she could continue her career as a singer. And,
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that. How would somebody get out of the Sea Organization for that? Did that happen routinely with L. Ron Hubbard, or what happened there?
Yeah, there were people that petitioned.
That's your dogs, right?
Yeah, that's my dogs. Yeah. Yeah, they just petitioned, and if they had a good enough reason, they were able to leave with no penalty. Some people blew and then they got penalized, but usually if they petitioned, it was approved and got out. My father got out of the Sea Org that way by petitioning Hubbard. So, okay. Yeah.
So it wasn't like, oh, you're declared a suppressive person and you have a huge freeloader debt or anything like that.
No, you could petition to get out.
Okay, great. All right, so then all of those people were involved. We had other celebrities and other people involved as well. And let me tell you a couple of stories of what happened in my dealings with the different celebrities. I got asked to bring Frank Stallone up to the base. Okay, and at the time, it was not generally known where Gillham Hot Springs was or the base. It was confidential location. Scientologists did not really know where it was. So I happened to be out during the time of recording the album. I had to go back and forth between Los Angeles to deal with the executive who was handling the packaging up and the design and that type of thing of the album. And I just happened to be in Los Angeles, and they said, hey, we're going to have Frank Stallone come up and record the album. Can you pick him up and bring him back to the Gold Base? And I said, sure, no problem. So I went and I picked him up at his place in Beverly Hills in my little Nissan Sentra. Couldn't have been nicer. He was a great guy, really funny. And so he sat in the front seat with me as we drove the 90 minutes out to Gillham Hot Springs. And the whole time we were driving out there, like he had been up on the crusade up in Portland, Oregon. The whole time he wanted to talk about women in the Sea Org. He wanted to talk about girls in the Sea Org. And he asked me, like, hey, if somebody who was not in the Sea Organization and they fell in love with somebody who was in the Sea Organization, would that be a problem?
Well, and that has happened at Celebrity Center. There were staff members who ended up marrying different celebrities.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it was funny because he was talking like a guy, you know what I mean? He wasn't talking like, I'm a Sea Org Scientologist or Sea Org member right. Long term. It was just a general, guy, and it was funny. We had a good conversation driving up. And then the second thing was John Travolta. Now, John Travolta, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people agree, he is the nicest celebrity I ever met in Scientology. Yeah. He was personable. You could approach him. You could talk to him. He what in Scientology we call grant you beingness, which is basically acknowledge you were there. Yeah. And he couldn't have been a nicer guy. He also had a track record of success as a singer. He had an album in 1976, it's 1976 when he was on Welcome Back, Kotter, and it was a big teen heartthrob album, and it was just a big success. And then, of course, he was in Greece, and he had #1 singles with Olivia Newton-John in Greece. Well, it was
he played Grease off Broadway before they did the film.
Right. Well, what happened when he came up to record on the Road to Freedom album, we were recording back in the days in the 80s. Anybody who understands technology today in terms of recording, we were recording on magnetic tape. Okay. And now everything's done digitally. And there's a digital program that singers use now called Pro Tools, which basically, if somebody sings and they're off key or out of, off pitch or anything like that, it can be corrected now with this digital tool called Pro Tools. So you could have somebody who sings terribly and then they'll adjust it and they sound like they're fantastic, right? Well, John had a problem when he was doing the Road to Freedom songs because he kept singing and they were out of pitch. And so he would sing and it would be like not great, you know what I mean? So it was left to Rick Cruzen, who was the gold musician recording and mixing, to entice John to try again. And then they'd try again and then try again. And then it got to the point where, like, hey, you got to be careful. You don't want to offend him because, he was had sold tons of albums and singing. Yeah. Anyway, and DM kept insisting, you got to do it again. You got to do it again. You got to do it again. Anyway, it got to the point where he wasn't going to do it again, and he didn't get upset about it, but he'd had enough. So we ended up using what we could on the album, and that's what we had. So those are the two stories.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so we finished the album, and then March 13th was rolling around, and it was decided to hold a big event at the Universal Studios Amphitheater in Los Angeles and Hollywood. And the amphitheater is no longer there, but it was a big indoor amphitheater. I don't know how many people it sat, 4,000, 5,000 people. And they would there'd be rock concerts and all sorts of shows there. And so we rented it out. And the plan was to do a big release of the album, play it, and have the live performances by the same people who recorded it, including Frank Stallone and Leif Garrett. We couldn't get John Travolta to come, but we got Chick Corea. And then this is where David Miscavige actually decided he was going to be the master of ceremonies of this event. Right. The idea was they were worried because L. Ron Hubbard had died that who's going to run things? Who's in charge? So they did a whole event where they had the Executive Director International, Guillaume Lessev. They had the Senior CS International, which was Ray Midoff at the time. They had the Commanding Officer of the Commodore's Messenger Org, Mark Yeager, come up, and they had them do little speeches, which became the blueprint for all future international events over the next, 20, 30 years, right? And of course, Miscavige, he wasn't going to speak. He was going to be the person who introduced all the speakers, and he was also going to be the focus of attention. Now, David he'd never been, out front and didn't, he was behind the scenes. People didn't know who he was. Right. The final person that he introduced on the stage was this person, and this was Annie Broker, Annie Tidman, Annie Rush, that we showed you earlier. And she and her husband, Pat, were the people that were believed to be in charge or were going to be taking over Scientology, because she and her husband had been the ones who were with LRH in hiding. Right, Janis?
Yeah, as far as everybody knew, they were the two that were with him. Yes. Yeah. But we got a surprise later on for another story.
But she hadn't really been seen. Janis recalls her being at the announcement of LRH's death. I don't remember that, but I do know a big deal was made of it at the March 13th event because they had her get a long white dress, a beautiful dress and makeup and all that. And she was the final speaker where she was brought out and introduced and said a few words and received a really warm acknowledgement from the public there for taking care of L. Ron Hubbard, right?
Right.
So that was the finale of that event.
Well, she is the person that L. Ron Hubbard left as in charge of everything.
That's right. Now, how did the Road to Freedom album do? Okay. So if I listen to it now, which by the way, in the description of this video, I'm going to put links to 2 YouTube videos, side 1 and side 2 of the Road to Freedom album, and also a link to just the song of L. Ron Hubbard singing, Thank You for Listening. Just for copyrights, we can't play the music on the video itself, but I'm going to put links down there so you can listen to it yourself. At the time, I remember being extremely proud of it, and I think everybody was proud of it. But you got to realize that this was 1986 in 1986 technology. And listening back to it now, it's not that great, in my opinion, when I think about it, because of all the advances in the singing and the songwriting and all that, right? And it's kind of like I told Janis, it's like watching a movie that you liked in the 1980s, a comedy and something, and you watch it now and you go like, gee, I really thought that was funny back then.
Right, it's not.
But that being said, we produced the album in vinyl, a vinyl record, because that was still in vogue at the time. And then we did cassettes. And we produced enough out of Golden Era Productions to sell 500,000 copies in like the first 3 or 4 months of its release. Okay.
That's pretty good
now,
for those days.
What's that?
That's pretty good for those days.
That's really good. As a matter of fact, 500,000 copies sold is a gold record. If you do 1 million copies, that's a platinum record. So gold record's a big deal for a recording artist. Okay. But what we found out how to qualify for a gold record, it wasn't how many copies you sold to individuals. It was how many you produced and sold to wholesale outlets. Okay. So who are our wholesale outlets? Every organization in Scientology. So we dumped tons of these things on all the organizations. And to their credit, they sold quite a few of them to the public Scientologists, but there wasn't 500,000 Scientologists. So what they did was they actually took them and they sold them to people who would then donate them or give them out to people. So Scientologists would be made to buy 20 or 30 copies at a time and then told to give it to your friends. You know, it's a way to disseminate Scientology is listening to this great music album. So that's how they got to the 500,000 copies sold.
Oh, right? That's interesting.
Yeah. And it's kind of the pattern that Miscavige has set up, you know, early in the 80s with L. Ron Hubbard's books. When Battlefield Earth was released in hardback, he had people raise money and basically the gold musicians, I remember, you know, your brother-in-law Fernando and the other people calling people at the org saying, here, we're going to send you money, go to your local Barnes and Noble and buy up every copy of the book, because they wanted to get it on the New York Times bestseller list. So this was a common pattern at the time.
Yeah, and get them sold before Thursday, 2:00.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's the story of what happened, okay? So Miscavige, you know, became the face of Scientology. And he went from this in 1986 announcing LRH's passing to this, where he's standing at the podium at every international event. Okay.
And no one else shows up at those events to speak.
No one else speaks up anymore. He's the face of Scientology there. To this, which is a picture of him at the last March 13th event last month.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What?
No, I just was with his brother a month ago, and I don't know how he's managed to have so much hair still at that age.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing, because his brother Ronnie and his dad Ron, who we knew well before he passed, and we knew him in Sea Org, they don't have any hair on top of their heads.
Exactly.
You know, Ron had to comb it over, and Ronnie's bald pretty much, isn't he?
Yeah, totally bald. Yeah.
So I've always suspected that Miscavige here, he either has a toupee or he's had hair plugs done by, you know, somebody he knows in Hollywood. Mark Headley mentioned that, you know, he has a hairstylist that does his hair for these events and poofs it up like that at $10,000 an event. So I'm sure he has the best hair plug specialist in the world in order to do that. But yeah, that's him now. He's 62 years old. When you saw the picture here in 1986, he was born in 1960. So do the math. He was 26 years old.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and he went from that to this, right?
Yeah. Wow. pretty amazing.
This is what we ended up with here. David
Yeah.
Miscavige, the face of Scientology the past 37 years. Now, Janis, one thing that you and I talked about separately is that he then decided he ran Scientology through management events or release events.
Yeah.
This was the start of it. He decided that, you know, there's 6 events a year or whatever it is, Auditor's Day, May 9th, New Year's, that type of thing. And so what he was going to do was force out and release new books, new tapes, new lectures, and basically get the public involved by going to these events rather than delivering Scientology services,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And then from there, it evolved into donations where people were donating money to the International Association of Scientologists. And then he realized that he didn't have to deliver anything because people would just willingly donate, you know, money, and they would basically, you know, force them into bankruptcy, charge up their credit cards and all that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was not, I mean, everything he was doing was off policy. Even doing events like that were off policy.
And I remember specifically, you know, after we left in 1990, we actually we wanted to see the first event afterwards.
Oh,
I found somebody that had a satellite dish. You know, this is 1990. This is before cable, you know, TV and that type of thing. But anyway, I paid somebody who had a satellite dish to record the event because Scientology would broadcast the event by a satellite to all the organizations in the United States, at least. And we got the address. I remember calling up the Las Vegas org and saying, hey, yeah, we live outside of Las Vegas, but we can't, you know, we want to see the event. What's the satellite coordinates? And they would give us the coordinates and we recorded it. But basically, I remember me sitting down with you and your husband, Paul, and we were basically going like, that's what Miscavige is going to do. He's going to run Scientology through these events. You know,
yeah.
he's not going to do anything else. That's going to be what he does from now on.
Well, and also we kept pointing out to each other all the different off-policy things he was doing and the stat pushing he was doing. You know, and then Dave LeBeau, I believe, was actually with us when we watched it.
Dave LeBeau was a private investigator that they sent in to spy on us. And yeah, he was there with us as well. We didn't know he was spying at the time.
Yeah, but I'd love to have seen what he reported up on what we were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, that's the story. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention, Janis, regarding the album or anything like that?
No, I think you pretty much got it. That's good.
All right. Well, we want to ask you all to please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Click that subscribe button. And then we also would like you, if you like this video, please click the like button. That helps us out. And then also, if you have a question, like I mentioned, please ask in the comments. And we look at every comment that people mention, write, and we will respond if there's questions in there. So please do so. And we hope to be doing live streams soon where you can we'll do a live event. You'll be able to answer questions. Ask questions and we'll answer them there on the live TV. Okay, Janis, anything else you want to say?
No, thank you for listening and for your support. We appreciate it.
We certainly do. And we just want to say, have a great day.